The wedding day secret. The morning sun spilled golden light over the quiet town, touching the rooftops with a warm glow that promised joy and celebration. Inside the small but beautifully decorated chapel, guests moved about with cheerful anticipation. White ribbons and fresh flowers adorned the wooden pews, and sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the polished floor with patterns of color. The air carried that unmistakable mix of perfume, polished wood, and excitement that always came before a wedding. Everyone was whispering about how handsome David Matthews looked in his tuxedo, standing near the altar with nervous pride in his eyes. David, a man in his mid-30s with a kind smile that rarely left his face, had been waiting for this day for months. After years of loneliness following the tragic loss of his wife, he had finally found someone who, at least to him, seemed to bring light back into his world. Emily Carter, with her golden hair and dazzling smile, had swept into his life like a dream, and David had embraced that dream with all the hope of a man eager to begin again. He glanced at his son, Ethan, who stood dutifully near him, holding the small velvet pillow with the rings tied neatly on top. Ethan was only 8 years old, but there was something unusually sharp in his eyes, a maturity that seemed older than his years. He wore a miniature suit that matched his father's, his dark curls neatly combed, though they threatened to spring out of place with every nervous fidget. Everyone saw him as an adorable ring-bearer, the perfect image of childhood innocence. But beneath his polished exterior, Ethan's chest carried a weight that none of the smiling guests could see. His small hands pressed so tightly against the pillow that his knuckles had turned pale, and his eyes were not on the open doors where the bride would soon appear. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on his father, as if his heart was caught between fear and loyalty, as if he carried a secret too heavy for someone so young. He had wanted to speak, perhaps whisper to his father once more before the music began, but the sound of the organ filled the air and silenced his courage. The wedding march echoed across the room, prompting all the guests to rise. Their chairs creaked as they turned toward the double doors at the back of the chapel, their faces glowing with anticipation. The doors swung open, and Emily appeared, a vision in white lace and flowing silk, her veil trailing behind her like a river of snow. Gasps of admiration spread through the crowd. David's face lit up the moment he saw her, his eyes softening with adoration, his heart clearly laid bare. For him, this was the happiest day of his life. For Ethan, however, it was the most terrifying. He felt a knot twist inside his stomach, his thoughts racing back to moments that haunted him, moments when Emily's smile had faded the instant his father's back was turned. Everyone else saw a bride filled with love, but Ethan saw someone else entirely, someone who whispered cruel words, someone who left invisible bruises on his confidence, someone who had turned his safe world into a place of fear. As Emily walked slowly down the aisle, every step measured, every gesture perfect, Ethan's mind drifted back to the first time he had met her. It had been a crisp autumn afternoon when his father had excitedly picked him up from school. David's face had glowed in a way Ethan hadn't seen since his mother was alive. He had driven home in such a rush, his words tumbling out with eagerness. "I've got someone very special I want you to meet, buddy," he had said, his voice light, almost boyish in its excitement. Ethan had stared out the window then, his heart tight with uncertainty, since his mother's passing. It had been just him and his dad, and though he wanted his father to be happy, the idea of someone else stepping into their small world filled him with unease. When they arrived home, Emily had been waiting on the porch, her golden hair catching the sunlight, her smile radiant. She had knelt to meet Ethan's eyes, her voice smooth as honey when she said, "So nice to finally meet you, Ethan. Your dad talks about you all the time." Ethan had nodded shyly, surprised at the softness of her tone, and for a brief moment, hope had flickered inside him. Perhaps she could be kind. Perhaps she could fill the empty space in their lives. But that hope didn't last long. The weeks that followed showed him a side of Emily that only he seemed to notice. When David was around, Emily laughed at Ethan's jokes, helped him with schoolwork, and played the part of a loving soon-to-be stepmother. But when David was gone, her face hardened, her words sharpened, and Ethan found himself shrinking under the weight of her disapproval. She criticized him for leaving toys in the living room, scolded him for spilling juice, and ignored him when he tried to share the things that mattered most to him. At first, Ethan thought it was just him being difficult, but the more it happened, the more he realized Emily wore two masks, one for his father and one for him. Ethan remembered one night vividly. His father had been working late, and Emily had been in charge of dinner. He had been excited, wanting to share what he had learned in school about the planets. "Miss Emily," he had said carefully, "do you like space? We're learning about the solar system, and my favorite planet is—" But before he could finish, Emily had cut him off sharply, her eyes never leaving her phone. "I'm busy right now. Eat your food quietly." Her tone had stung more than any slap could have. The silence that followed had been heavy, suffocating, and Ethan had eaten in silence, pushing peas around his plate while his chest ached. Now, standing in the chapel with the rings in his hand, his chest carried the weight of every cruel remark, every cold glare, every moment when he had been made to feel unwanted. His father was moments away from marrying a woman who carried secrets darker than anyone could see, and Ethan was the only one who knew the truth. He had tried once to tell his father. He had gathered all his courage one night and confessed that he didn't think Emily liked him. But David, blinded by love and the desire for a new beginning, had brushed aside his words with gentle reassurance. "She adores you, Ethan. You just need to give her a chance." But Ethan knew better. He had seen the truth in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. He had felt it in the tight grip of her hand when he made a mistake. He had heard it in the hiss of her whispered threats. And now, as Emily reached the altar, her hand slipping gracefully into David's, Ethan felt his pulse race with a mix of fear and determination. The officiant's voice began to echo, speaking of love, unity, and new beginnings, but Ethan's thoughts drowned it all out. He stood there torn between silence and courage, knowing that if he spoke, everything would change. His father's happiness, the smiles on the guests' faces, the carefully planned day, it would all shatter. But if he remained silent, his father would walk into a life built on lies, and Ethan would be left alone with the shadow of Emily's cruelty. His small fingers trembled against the pillow as his young mind wrestled with the decision that even grown men would struggle to make. The ceremony continued, each word of the officiant bringing the moment closer when David and Emily would be bound together. Ethan's chest tightened with every vow, every promise, every laugh from the guests. He glanced at his father, who looked so proud, so unaware, and his heart ached. He wanted his dad to be happy more than anything, but happiness built on deception would not last. And so, as the final words of the officiant echoed and the moment of truth arrived, Ethan knew he had to decide whether to stay silent or to step forward and speak the words that could change everything. The hidden side of Emily. The wedding guests laughed softly as the ceremony moved forward, but Ethan's mind was far away, trapped in memories he could not escape. Behind the veil of smiles and music lay a truth only he knew, a truth about Emily that burned inside him like a secret fire. To everyone else she was radiant, the perfect bride who had healed a grieving man's heart. But Ethan remembered all too well the times when the mask had slipped. Each memory rose before him with such clarity that it felt as if the chapel itself was haunted by shadows only he could see. It had started subtly, so subtle that an outsider might have thought Ethan was simply imagining it. The first time he noticed it was one rainy afternoon when David had been called away to the office. Emily had been left in charge of watching Ethan, and she had arrived at the house with the same warm smile she always wore for David. But the moment the car engine faded into the distance, her expression hardened. She walked into the living room where Ethan was building a small tower out of Lego bricks and looked down at the colorful pile with an exasperated sigh. "You know, you could at least keep your toys in one place," she muttered, her voice stripped of the honey-like sweetness she always used when David was present. Ethan had looked up at her, startled, unsure how to respond. He had never heard her sound so cold. Gathering his courage, he mumbled, "I'll clean it up later, Miss Emily." But her eyes narrowed, and for a brief second he saw a flicker of disdain, as though she was irritated simply by his presence. She turned away sharply, muttering under her breath, Your father spoils you far too much." Those words stayed with Ethan for days. He had wondered if perhaps he had done something wrong, but deep down he knew she had meant them. The mask she wore became even more obvious in the weeks that followed. During dinners when David was there, Emily would laugh at Ethan's jokes, compliment his drawings, and fuss over whether he had enough to eat. But when David left the table, even just to take a phone call, her attention would vanish. She would scroll through her phone, tapping her long nails against the screen, ignoring Ethan as though he were invisible. On nights when David worked late, the charade was stripped away entirely. She became impatient, sharp, even cruel. Ethan remembered one night when he had accidentally spilled water on the kitchen floor while trying to fill his cup. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering into tiny shards. His heart had pounded as Emily stormed into the room, her eyes blazing. "Look what you've done," she hissed, grabbing his arm so tightly that tears sprang to his eyes. "Do you think I have time to clean up after your clumsiness? You're just like your mother must have been, weak and careless." The words cut deeper than her grip, for Ethan's mother was the one person he missed every day, the one memory that brought him comfort. To hear Emily use her name like a weapon made his small body tremble. She bent down close, her voice low and threatening. "If you ever tell your father about this, you'll regret it. Do you understand?" Ethan had nodded through his tears, his throat too tight to speak. That night, he had cleaned the shards as carefully as his trembling hands allowed, while Emily retreated into the living room, humming lightly as if nothing had happened. When David returned home later, Emily greeted him with a radiant smile and a kiss, wrapping her arms around him as though she had been nothing but nurturing all evening. Ethan had stood at the foot of the stairs, silently watching, his heart aching with the knowledge that the woman his father adored was not who she pretended to be. The cruelest moments were not always loud or violent. Sometimes they were quiet, delivered with surgical precision to cut Ethan down. When he proudly showed her a drawing he had worked on for hours, she glanced at it with disinterest and said, "That's nice, but shouldn't you be focusing on something useful? Your father spends a lot on your school, you know." When he beamed about scoring well on a test, she shrugged and replied, "Well, you should aim higher. There's always someone better than you." Little by little, her words chipped away at his confidence until Ethan began to doubt himself, shrinking under the weight of her constant criticism. Ethan wanted to tell his father. He wanted to run into his study, cry out the truth, and beg him to listen. And one evening he tried. He had walked into the room, his small hands twisting the hem of his shirt as David worked through some documents at his desk. "Dad," Ethan began timidly, "I don't think Emily likes me very much." David had looked up, startled, then smiled kindly. "Of course she likes you, son. Emily adores you. She talks about you all the time." Ethan had shaken his head, desperation making his voice tremble. "No, Dad, she's different when you're not around. She says mean things. But David, eager to protect the image of happiness he had built, gently cut him off. "Buddy, I know this is hard. It's a big change, and maybe you're just nervous, but I promise Emily loves us both. You'll see." Ethan had left the room with tears in his eyes, feeling more isolated than ever. His father's trust in Emily was unshakable, and Ethan feared that saying more would only make things worse. So he carried the burden alone, withdrawing into himself. He spent more time in his room, less time laughing, less time sharing stories with his dad. David noticed the change but assumed it was just the adjustment of a boy to a new family. The truth was far darker, and Ethan carried it in silence. The only person who seemed to notice his quiet suffering was his grandmother, Helen. She was a strong woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. One Sunday afternoon, when she visited and found Ethan unusually quiet, she sat beside him on the porch swing. "What troubles you, my dear boy?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Ethan hesitated, biting his lip, torn between fear and relief. Finally, he whispered, "I don't think Miss Emily is nice. She's not how she acts around Dad." Helen studied him for a long moment, her expression grave. She didn't push him for details, but she rested a hand on his shoulder and said, "The truth always shines, Ethan, no matter how dark the night. Don't be afraid to speak it when the time comes." Those words stayed with him, fueling a quiet determination inside his small frame. He didn't know how or when, but he knew one day he would have to reveal the truth. He couldn't let his father be blinded forever. He couldn't let a woman who wore masks and whispered lies take the place of the mother he had lost. And as the wedding day drew nearer, that sense of duty grew stronger, even as fear pressed down on him. The night before the wedding, as David fussed with his tuxedo and hummed cheerfully, Ethan sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling. He thought of all the times Emily had hurt him, all the cruel words, all the false smiles. He thought of his father's happiness, how fragile it would be if built on deception. And he thought of Grandma Helen's words, that the truth always shines. In that moment, Ethan made a silent vow. He would not let the wedding pass without speaking. He would not let his father walk blindly into a life with someone who carried darkness behind her smile. In the chapel the next day, as the vows moved closer to completion, Ethan's pulse raced. He knew he could no longer hold back. The time was coming when his voice, small but unshakable, would have to rise above the music and the murmurs of the crowd. And when it did, everything would change. The investigation, the days leading up to the wedding, had felt heavy, like clouds gathering before a storm. Ethan had carried his grandmother's words in his heart, repeating them to himself whenever fear threatened to silence him. The truth always shines, Ethan, no matter how dark the night. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things. His father adored Emily so completely that mere words weren't enough. Ethan realized that if he wanted his dad to believe him, he needed something undeniable, something stronger than his frightened voice. That realization marked the beginning of his secret investigation. It began one Saturday afternoon, just 3 weeks before the wedding. David had been called into the office unexpectedly, leaving Emily at home with Ethan. She had been in the kitchen, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone on her phone. Ethan, who had been walking down the hall, paused when he heard his name. He stopped, heart thudding, pressing his back against the wall just out of sight. "Yes, I know the boy is suspicious," Emily whispered harshly, "but David doesn't see it. He's too wrapped up in his feelings. As long as I keep smiling in front of him, he'll never know." There was a long pause, then her voice dropped lower, tinged with irritation. "Don't worry, once the wedding is done, everything will fall into place. And then, well, the money will solve everything, won't it?" Ethan's small body trembled as he listened. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. She was hiding something about money, and she knew his father was blind to it. His chest tightened with a mixture of fear and anger. He had wanted to burst into the kitchen and shout the truth right then, but his grandmother's words rang in his ears. Wait for the right moment. Let the truth shine when it can't be denied. He tiptoed back to his room, every step heavy with the knowledge that Emily's lies went far deeper than cruel words and false smiles. From that moment, Ethan began to watch Emily with sharper eyes. He noticed how she always carried her phone with her, never leaving it unattended. He noticed how she avoided questions about her past, changing the subject whenever David asked about her family or childhood. And he noticed how small packages would sometimes arrive for her, which she would whisk away before anyone could see. Ethan's curiosity grew into determination. If Emily was hiding something dangerous, he would uncover it. The opportunity came one evening when Emily left her purse on the living room table while she went upstairs to take a call. Ethan sat on the couch, his heart pounding, staring at the leather bag as though it were a locked treasure chest filled with answers. He knew it was wrong to snoop, but he also knew it might be his only chance. With trembling fingers, he unzipped the purse and peeked inside. Amid the usual clutter of makeup and receipts, one envelope caught his eye. It was thick, sealed, and marked with bold red letters. Final notice. Ethan didn't fully understand, but he knew it was important. He quickly shoved the envelope under his shirt just as he heard Emily's footsteps descending the stairs. Back in his room, he opened it carefully, spreading the papers out across his bed. His eyes scanned the words, most of which he didn't fully grasp, but one thing stood out clearly. Emily owed a large amount of money. It was a debt notice, threatening legal action if she didn't pay. Ethan's small hands shook as he pieced it together. She was marrying his father not out of love but out of desperation. His father, who had worked so hard to rebuild his life, was about to walk into a trap. But the debt notice wasn't the only clue. Over the following week, Ethan gathered more fragments of truth. He noticed a locked drawer in Emily's study desk that she never let anyone near. One night, when she had left the house to run errands, Ethan tiptoed into the room with a hairpin he had borrowed from Grandma Helen. It took him several tries, but the drawer finally clicked open. Inside were documents, letters, receipts, and photographs. His eyes widened as he studied them. One letter was from a man he had never heard of, filled with words of affection and promises of a future together. Another was a receipt for an expensive necklace purchased only a month earlier, though David had mentioned she had financial struggles. And then there was a photograph hidden beneath the pile showing Emily with the same man from the letter, their arms around each other, smiling as though they were already married. Ethan's stomach knotted with dread. This was no longer just about her being unkind. She was deceiving his father on a scale far larger than he could have imagined. She had debts, lies, and even another relationship. The reality was worse than any nightmare. Ethan carefully placed the documents back in the drawer, locking it once more, but he slipped the photograph into his pocket. It was the proof he needed, the proof that would make his father listen. Still, fear gnawed at him. What if Emily discovered what he had done? What if she turned her anger on him again, harsher than before? For days, Ethan avoided her gaze, keeping his distance, his small heart pounding with the weight of his secret. But each time doubt threatened him, he remembered the way Emily had grabbed his arm, the way she had whispered threats, the way she had spoken on the phone about money. That gave him strength. One evening, while David worked in the garage repairing a broken chair, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his grandmother, who had come over to help with wedding preparations. He hesitated, then pulled the photograph from his pocket and slid it across the table. Helen's sharp eyes scanned it, her expression darkening. She looked at Ethan, her voice low but steady. "Where did you find this?" "In her drawer," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "She has letters, too, and papers. She owes money. She's lying to Dad." Helen took his small hand in hers, squeezing it firmly. "You did the right thing, Ethan. But this is dangerous. We must be careful. Your father loves her and his heart is blind right now. But when the time is right, you must show him. Not just tell him, shh, show him." Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with a strange mixture of fear and courage. For the first time, he felt he had more than words. He had evidence. He wasn't just a child crying out against shadows. He was the keeper of truth. As the wedding day loomed closer, Ethan prepared himself. He tucked the photograph safely into the inside pocket of his small suit jacket, fastening it with care. If the moment came, he would be ready. He didn't know how the guests would react, how his father would feel, or what Emily might do. But one thing was certain: he would not stay silent. And so, in the chapel, as the vows grew nearer, Ethan's fingers brushed against the hidden pocket of his jacket. He could feel the photograph like a burning coal against his chest. His pulse thundered in his ears as he realized what was about to happen. Soon the truth he carried would shatter the perfect picture Emily had painted, and the storm that followed would be unlike anything the Matthews family had ever faced. The shocking reveal. The chapel was hushed, the weight of expectation hanging heavy in the air. The officiant's voice carried across the room, solemn and steady, guiding David and Emily toward the vows that would bind them together. Guests leaned forward in their seats, smiling warmly, their eyes shining with joy, as if they too were part of the love story unfolding at the altar. To them, it was a moment of beauty. Two lives uniting, a new beginning. But to Ethan, standing only steps away, it was a nightmare taking form before his eyes. Emily stood radiant in her gown, her veil glowing in the sunlight pouring through the stained glass. Her hand rested delicately in David's, her eyes glistening with what appeared to be tears of happiness. She was the perfect bride in every visible way, and yet, beneath her beauty, Ethan saw something no one else seemed to notice: the subtle tightening of her jaw, and the flicker of calculation in her eyes, the way she glanced toward the guests, not with humility, but with the pride of someone who had won. Ethan's fingers brushed against the hidden pocket inside his jacket where the photograph rested, the proof of everything he had discovered. His heart pounded against his ribs, so loud he feared everyone could hear it. He knew what he was about to do would stop the wedding, that it would shock the guests, embarrass his father, and possibly make Emily furious beyond anything he had ever seen. But he also knew he had no choice. This was the moment his grandmother had told him to wait for, the moment when truth must shine, no matter the cost. The officiant's words came to a pause, his voice rising to the most anticipated question of the ceremony. If anyone here has reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The chapel remained silent. Guests glanced at each other with gentle smiles, as though nothing could possibly stand in the way of this union. David's face glowed with anticipation, his eyes locked on Emily with an almost childlike hope. But Ethan felt his entire body tremble, his throat tightening. This was it, the only chance he had. And if he stayed silent, his father's life would be chained to lies and betrayal. Before his courage could falter, Ethan stepped forward. His small voice cut through the silence, trembling but clear. "Wait, please don't marry her." The words echoed across the chapel like a stone dropped into still water. Gasps erupted among the guests. David's head snapped toward his son in shock, his eyes wide, confusion etched across his face. Emily froze, her smile faltering, her knuckles whitening around the bouquet she clutched. "Ethan," David said, his voice strained. "What are you doing?" The boy swallowed hard, his eyes brimming with tears, but his voice steadier than he expected. "She's not who you think she is, Dad. She's lying to you." The guests murmured, turning toward one another in disbelief. Emily let out a nervous laugh, the sound brittle. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. "I know this is hard for you, but—" "No!" Ethan's voice cracked louder now, filled with desperation. "You're not nice when Dad isn't around. You say mean things. You hurt me. You only pretend in front of him." The chapel fell silent again, the air electric with tension. David's face drained of color, torn between disbelief and shock. Emily's jaw tightened, but she quickly regained her composure, turning to the guests with a graceful smile. "Children can struggle with change," she said smoothly. "He's nervous. He doesn't understand." But before she could finish, Ethan pulled the photograph from his pocket with trembling hands and held it high for everyone to see. "Then why do you have this?" His small voice cracked with emotion, but the picture spoke louder than words. Gasps rippled through the crowd as guests craned their necks to see. It was unmistakable. Emily, arm in arm with another man, smiling as though they were already married. David's eyes locked on the photo, his face frozen, disbelief and betrayal battling in his expression. "That's not what it looks like," Emily snapped, her voice sharp now, the sweetness gone. "It's just an old friend." But Ethan cut her off, his courage swelling. "You lied. You have letters from him. You bought things you never told Dad about. You said on the phone that you only need the money. You don't love him." His small voice cracked, but his words landed like thunder, shaking the room. The officiant looked bewildered, clutching his book awkwardly as though unsure whether to continue. The GUIs whispered urgently, some covering their mouths in shock, others staring at Emily with narrowed eyes. David's hand fell from Emily's grasp as though it burned him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind spinning as fragments of memory and doubt collided. He remembered the times Emily had dodged questions about her past, the excuses she had given about her finances, the packages that arrived without explanation. His love for her had blinded him, but now, under the weight of his son's courage, the truth could no longer be ignored. "Is this true?" David's voice was low, trembling, but it carried the force of a man who desperately wanted to believe otherwise. He turned to Emily, his eyes pleading for honesty. Emily's mask cracked, her smile faltered, her eyes flicked around the room, searching for sympathy but finding only suspicion. "David, don't listen to him," she insisted, her voice rising. "He's just a child. He doesn't know what he's talking about." But David's gaze turned to his son, who stood small but unyielding, the photograph trembling in his hand. Ethan's brown eyes, filled with tears but burning with conviction, met his father's. "Please, Dad, believe me. I don't want you to get hurt." For a long moment, silence pressed against the walls of the chapel. Then David's expression hardened, the realization crashing over him like a wave. He stepped back from Emily, his eyes filled with anger and heartbreak. Answer me, Emily. Who is this man? Why do you have letters and photos with him? Why didn't you tell me about your debts? Emily's face twisted, her calm facade unraveling. She tried to speak, to weave another excuse, but the murmurs of the guests grew louder, suspicion filling the air. Her composure shattered, and in her desperation she snapped. Because you were too easy, David. You wanted love so badly you never saw the truth. Do you think I'd settle for your small life if I didn't need what you had? I played the part, and you believed it. The chapel erupted in chaos. Guests gasped, some standing, others shaking their heads in disbelief. David staggered back as though struck, his heart breaking before everyone's eyes. Ethan clutched the photograph to his chest, trembling, but his courage remained firm. He had done it. He had spoken the truth. But the storm was far from over. Emily's eyes darted wildly, her hands tightening on the bouquet until the flowers snapped beneath her grip. Her breathing grew sharp, her voice venomous. You ruined everything, you little brat, she hissed at Ethan, loud enough that several guests heard. Her mask was gone now, her fury laid bare. David instinctively stepped in front of his son, his protective instincts flaring. Don't you dare speak to him like that, he said, his voice filled with steel. For the first time, David truly saw Emily for what she was, and the realization made his skin crawl. The officiant backed away nervously, the guests murmuring louder, panic starting to ripple through the room. The perfect wedding had collapsed into a nightmare of betrayal and anger, and the air was thick with tension. And as Emily's composure unraveled completely, her movements grew erratic, her anger boiling over into something dangerous. Ethan, pressed against his father's side, clutched the pillow with the rings in one hand and the photograph in the other. His small body trembled, but his heart was strangely calm. He had done what he needed to do. He had spoken the truth. The rest now lay in the hands of the adults around him. And then, as Emily's voice rose into a furious scream, her mask gone, her lies exposed, David knew there was only one thing left to do: call for help. The call to 911. The chapel was no longer a place of celebration. Where moments earlier there had been laughter, whispers of joy, and the quiet rustle of dresses and suits, now there was only chaos. Lee's mask had slipped entirely, and the venom of her words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Guests were whispering urgently, some standing to leave, others frozen in disbelief as though their minds couldn't process how quickly a dream had twisted into a nightmare. At the center of it all stood David, his hand gripping Ethan's shoulder protectively, his eyes locked on the woman he had nearly given his future to. Emily's beauty was still there. Her gown shimmered under the sunlight, her veil framed her golden hair, but it was no longer radiant. It was grotesque, a costume clinging to a truth that could no longer be hidden. Her blue eyes, once sparkling with carefully crafted charm, were now wild, darting from guest to guest, searching for sympathy she no longer had. The bouquet she held was crushed in her hands, petals falling to the floor like broken promises. You don't understand, Emily cried suddenly, her voice shrill, slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. I had no choice. You think your precious David would have looked at me twice if I had told him the truth? You all judge me, but you've never lived with nothing, with debts piling so high you can't breathe. I needed this. I deserved this. Her words spilled out in a torrent, but they carried no grace, no sweetness, only the bitterness of someone whose carefully constructed lies had crumbled before her eyes. David shook his head, his chest heaving with the weight of betrayal. You lied to me, he said, his voice breaking. You lied about everything, about who you are, about what you wanted, and you threatened my son. His words echoed with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. Ethan pressed closer to his father, clutching the photograph tightly as if it were a shield. Emily's gaze shifted to Ethan, and for a moment her face twisted with pure rage. You ruined everything, she hissed, her voice dropping low, sharp enough that several guests gasped. She took a step forward, her movements jerky and unpredictable, and the sight sent a ripple of fear through the chapel. Some guests cried out for her to stop, others moved closer to the aisle as though ready to shield the boy if needed. David raised a hand, his protective instincts overwhelming every other thought. Stay away from him, he barked, his voice thunderous, echoing off the high ceiling. The authority in his tone, the raw determination of a father defending his child, silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. but Emily's fury had gone too far. The officiant, pale and trembling, lowered his book and took several steps back, his eyes darting toward the nearest exit. Grandma Helen rose from her seat, her expression sharp as steel, her hands clutching her cane tightly. "Enough," she called out, her voice commanding despite her age. "This is no place for your lies and tantrums, Emily. The truth has come out, and you cannot hide from it now." But Emily wasn't listening. Her breaths came fast and shallow, her chest heaving as though she were trapped in a corner. Her voice broke into a shriek echoing across the chapel. "I won't let you take this from me. I won't go back to nothing." She lunged forward, her hand reaching not for David, but toward Ethan. The chapel erupted in chaos. Guests screamed, some rushing forward, others pulling back in panic. Ethan's small body froze for an instant, his mind flashing with the memory of her fingers digging into his arm weeks earlier, the hiss of her threats, the icy disdain in her eyes. But before her hand could reach him, David moved with the speed of a man who had everything to lose. He stepped in front of Ethan, his arms spreading like a she, held his body forming an unbreakable wall between his son and the woman he had once loved. "Enough," David roared. His voice was so fierce, so filled with rage and heartbreak that it stopped Emily in her tracks. For a moment she faltered, her face twisting between anger and despair. And in that moment David reached into his pocket, his hands shaking, and pulled out his phone. His voice was steady, cold with finality as he spoke into the receiver. "This is David Matthews. I need police at St. Mary's Chapel immediately. It's an emergency." The words silenced the room. The reality of what was happening hit everyone at once. This was no longer just a wedding gone wrong. This was danger, deceit, and betrayal colliding in front of an entire congregation. The whispers grew again, sharp and urgent, while Emily's face drained of color. "No, no, you can't," she stammered, her voice trembling now. "David, please, you don't understand, I just—" But her pleas were empty, her words falling into a void that no longer held sympathy. The man before her was no longer the starry-eyed fiancé blinded by love. He was a father, a protector, and he had seen the truth with his own eyes. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the air outside the chapel, growing louder until the flashing red and blue lights painted the stained glass windows. The heavy doors swung open, and two uniformed officers entered, their presence commanding. The guests parted, relief and fear mingling in their faces. "That's her," David said firmly, his voice low but unshakable as he pointed to Emily. "She lied, she threatened my son, and she's not safe." His arms stayed protectively around Ethan, whose small body leaned against him, trembling but resolute.